The jury has been selected. Tell us about that process today.
Well, we do now have a full jury sworn in. That's 12 members of the jury itself, plus 6 alternates. When we started the day on Friday, most of them had already been selected. We had the jury, but only one of those alternates who basically are there to swap in just in case throughout the trial. But those final 5 were selected on Friday. This is actually much sooner than we had planned. There was talk that it could take a whole nother week to select the jury. That's because, as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to find people able to serve on this trial. The first trial of this type of a former US president in history, because they need to be neutral enough to be able to serve on this case, not giving their own political biases. Many people will have their own opinions of Donald Trump. He was, of course, the president here for 4 years, and he also has been in the spotlight over the past few years, even when he's not in the White House. He's facing several criminal trials across the US, as well as civil cases as well. So many people do have very strong opinions about the former president. The jurors were asked questions to try and really get to the bottom of what they believe about the former president. They were asked, for example, about their media consumption, what news channels they watch, what newspapers they read, whether they have social media and what they post on those platforms. Their accounts were scoured by both the defense and the prosecution to try and determine whether these people were in favor or against Donald Trump. But they were whittled down one by one to be able to get to that final jury selection. And those are the people who are going to determine the fate of Donald Trump in the next few weeks. Now, as part of this case, we know that there is certain bits of evidence that was discussed this week, which both the prosecution and defense tried to argue should or shouldn't be allowed to enter as proceedings go on starting next week. And we also heard discussions about Donald Trump's gag order, which has been imposed on him. He's not under that order allowed to speak about, for example, the judge's family, court officers and witnesses, the jury in the case, as he's been seen to do in other cases. Now, Donald Trump is charged with 34 felony counts. This is related to a payment made to adult film star Stormy Daniels in the lead up to the 2016 election. Now, what's contentious here is whether Donald Trump paid back his then fixer, Michael Cohen, for that money and how that money was then filed. He claims to have done nothing wrong. He's pleaded not guilty to all of those criminal charges. Here's what he said earlier.
I'm not allowed to speak, and I want to be able to speak to the press and everybody else about it. So why am I gagged about telling the truth? I'm only telling the truth. They're not telling the truth. The judge has to take off this gag order. It's very, very unfair that my constitutional rights have been taken away.
Now, speaking to reporters after the court closed for the day, Donald Trump once again called this a giant witch hunt, language he's used many times before. On Monday, we're expecting to see opening statements begin at 9:30 a.m. local time. Back to you.
All eyes on that courthouse once again on Monday. Sally Patterson starting us off from New York tonight. Thanks. All right, for a look at what to expect on Monday, let's turn now to Renato Mariotti. Renato is a former U.S. federal prosecutor, and he joins us tonight from Chicago. Thanks for being here. The jury has been selected. We are now set for opening statements on Monday. Are you surprised that all of this came together so quickly?
I am surprised. I thought it might take a little longer to select a jury. But, frankly, I think the defense was overly aggressive early on in using their strikes. As a result, I gave the prosecution an opportunity to quickly seat a bunch of jurors. We have a jury, and it's a jury that I think will be impartial in this case.
That's interesting because, Trump has repeatedly said that he can't get a fair trial in New York City. He is facing felony charges related to hush money payments that he made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. What's the prosecution trying to prove here?
So the prosecution has charged Donald Trump with falsification of business records. So the allegations here are not a hush money scheme. I mean, that is an underlying fact, but rather they focus on the fact that that hush money scheme resulted in false entries in the books and records of the Trump Organization. Specifically, that the payments to Stormy Daniels were actually recorded as payments to Michael Cohen for legal services rendered. There's no question that he wasn't actually performing legal services. That's not what those payments were for. And so I think the trial is really going to focus on whether Donald Trump knew about those false entries in the books and records, and then also whether the purpose of those false entries was to conceal another crime, which is the element here that turns that otherwise misdemeanor charge into a Class E felony.
How strong is the case?
I think the case is strong when it comes to the fact that the business records are false. The question I think that is really going to be challenging for the prosecution is to prove that Trump knew about the false records and that he intended to use them to conceal another crime, namely an election crime. I think realistically, the prosecution is on very firm footing for a misdemeanor. I think the real question is whether or not they'll be able to prove that there's a felony charge here.
So if he is found guilty, give me the scenario in terms of what potential penalty he could be facing.
Personally, I believe it's unlikely that the former president will serve prison time. And this is a low-end felony, the lowest class of felony in the New York state system. And a lot of defendants would not get a prison time for this particular offense if they're a first-time offender. I think given the circumstances, who he is, the complications that would come with imprisoning him, I suspect that the judge will not impose a term of imprisonment.
And of course, Trump denies any wrongdoing in this case. We are expecting, as I said, opening statements on Monday. What do you think we'll hear from both sides?
Well, the prosecution is going to focus on, I think, two things. One is they're going to, I think, really help the jury understand that this whole scheme couldn't have existed and couldn't have remained hidden if it were not for the records at issue. The strength of their case is that there's no question that the hush money payments were made. There's also no serious question that there are false entries in the books and records of the Trump Organization. The focus from the defense's perspective is going to be on whether Donald Trump knew about these false statements or whether he simply was aware of the hush money scheme and did not realize that these false statements were being made in books and records of the Trump Organization. The prosecution is also going to focus a lot on why this case is important. They have characterized it or labeled it as an election interference case. I expect the defense to try to take shots at that and that to be an ongoing debate throughout the trial as well.
All right, well, we will see what happens on Monday. Renato, appreciate your analysis tonight. That is former U.S. federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti joining us tonight from Chicago.